Great. So it is July 21st, 2021, and my name is Bill Froehlich, and I'm here with former senior conciliator Timothy Johnson for a first interview. Mr. Johnson is our first interviewee for the Civil Rights Mediation Oral History Project. Mr. Johnson, if you could simply tell us your name so we have it for the record, your time at CRS, and the positions you held.
Okay, my name is Timothy Johnson. I was with CRS from '84 to 2010. The positions I held were a conciliation specialist, chief of field coordination, and then back in the field as senior conciliation specialist.
Thank you. Wonderful. I sent you a few interview questions in advance, generally, and we're going to go through many of those questions today. There's some sub-questions I didn't send you because I did not want to overwhelm you. But why don't we go ahead and get started? So can you tell us a little bit about your career trajectory prior to coming to CRS?
Sure. From 66 to 69, I was in the United States Army. I served in Thailand for a year. I was a non-combat soldier. Got out in March of 1969. From 69 to 71, I went to college. I also had jobs at Northport VA Hospital as an orderly and a short while as a mail carrier for the post office, which was helpful because at the time, my wife was pregnant and required a cesarean, and they paid for it. So that was very, very helpful. From 71 to 73, while still going to school, I was an academic teacher at the Suffolk County, Long Island jail. And then later at the Suffolk County, Long Island Honor Farm. I graduated with a BA in social science in 73. We moved down to Richmond, Virginia, where I became an academic teacher for the Virginia State Department of Corrections, and also went to graduate school. I was a school teacher and then switched over to being a counselor. And in 75, I graduated with a master's in counseling. And in 78, I left the Department of Corrections and became an adult criminal justice specialist for the state of Virginia. At that time, each state had a state planning agency for criminal justice purposes, and they received money from an organization called LEAA, Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, and I did that. And then in '84, I joined the LEAA in Washington, D.C., where I was at first a program analyst. I then switched over to being a juvenile justice specialist. That happened 78 to 84. And then in 84, I joined the CRS. In federal government, politics plays a part. And when the political parties changed, and I was with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, they named, the new management came in and named 5 people that they wanted to get rid of, 4 of whom I could understand. And the remaining one was me, and I thought, well, I'm not really nearly as cool as those other 4 people. We thought otherwise. So What they do is they put you on a shelf. Since firing federal employees is so difficult, they just say, well, we're going to change your duties. And they put me on a shelf, which meant I literally had nothing to do. I could have just sat there and waited out the 8 years of that administration and done nothing, which people have done. They come in and do the crosswords, and they write books or whatever. I chose not to do that, and I looked for another job, and I found CRS at that time. There was an opening in the New York regional office, which I took. I stayed there for a while. Then there was, they offered me a job in Washington, D.C. as being chief of field coordination, and my feeble ego blew up, and I thought, oh my God, I'll be a chief. This is so cool. And it was not what I had hoped it would be. You mentioned earlier Wally Warfield. Wally Warfield was at one time the chief of field coordination. And he was a very trusted and welcomed ally of mine. When I came into the New York regional office, I took his position. He had left to go to Washington, D.C. and left the vacancy. And he went down to Washington as chief of field coordination and later deputy director, and for a short period, director. But the thing about the job was that it was first something I very strongly believed in, making peace and advancing civil rights. And what we did at that time was we would have to write reports on everything that we did, every case. So you would write what they called an alert, which was just an announcement that we think this is a problem and we're going to look into it. And then we would write an assessment. I spoke to all sides involved, and this is what they said, and they agreed to go forward to conciliation or mediation. And then you would write and reports on how you were doing and progressing in the conciliation, and then finally a final report on what the results were. Now, every conciliation specialist typed their own reports. This was well before word processing and whatnot. And headquarters had hard copies of every report, which was massive. And every once in a while, you would receive back a note from Wally Warfield. Read your report, looks good, you're doing a good job, have you considered XYZ? And I just thought, what a fabulous resource this guy is. This is incredible that he would take time to help a little schmuck like me out. And he read every report that came in every week, which is, figure there was 10 regions, and some regions a little more than others, but that was, 100 reports that he would read. And he not only read them, but he commented on them. He encouraged you. He helped you. He trained you. He said, and that was one of his terms. Have you thought about? And I would say to myself as I was reading that, no, it never occurred to me at all. What a great idea! And then I would do that, and then he would, and I would report back, I did so and so, and the disputants responded positively, blah blah blah, and he would write back, great job. So during that time, when I was with the New York office, it was a really fascinating time. When I first got there, there was another conciliator named Johnson. So they hooked me up with Johnson. So we became Johnson and Johnson. And we would walk, we would go around to cases, and The other Johnson was African American, and we would introduce ourselves. He would say, "I'm John Johnson. This is Tim Johnson. No relation." Uh, so, uh, and I would learn the basics. This is how you do an assessment. This is, these are some ideas about where to go. I also had the advantage of working with Victor Rizzo, who at the time was the 14. Each region had a regional director and a 14. Ideally, the 14 was supposed to manage and do things like that. Mostly they didn't, but I had the advantage of watching, what John did and what Victor did, and then they said, "Okay, poof, you're on your own," which I welcomed. I thought this is great. I've got Wally Warfield in Washington reading my stuff, and he's giving me feedback. I'm on the right track. So I was very happy. Not happy with the bureaucracy, not happy with the politics, but really happy to be able to go out into the community and do exactly what Lyndon Johnson spoke about during the creation of the legislation for CRS. And what he said was, let us sit and reason together. And I thought, well, yeah, otherwise you're not going to make any progress at all. So I sat and reasoned with a whole bunch of people, and I worked 60 hours a week and never complained about it because I didn't have a job. I had a vocation. And I will point out that, again, you're in the federal government, politics is going to have effects. And during some administrations, we were shunned or not thought of as a resource and kind of pushed aside. Reagan did it, Bush 1 did it, Bush 2 did it. We were not a priority. And during one of those times, throughout the agency, staff felt very, very disheartened and discouraged. Like, what's the point? Why am I doing anything? Nobody cares. And at that time, we had a regional director in Seattle, Washington, whose name was Bob Lamb. I don't know if you've ever heard of Bob Lamb. Bob Lamb was 6'4", probably weighed 250, 260. When I knew him, he was already in his 60s. If Bob walked into a room and didn't say a word, everyone would just stop talking. I'm sure you've met people like this, just a magnanimous, he had an electric about him. He was an African-American who rose to the rank of captain in the Atlantic City Police Department during the 1950s. Very, very difficult to do as an African-American. He was not a college graduate, but he was a font of knowledge. And in conversation, he was, I should, for openness admit, he was my mentor. Don't know why. I'm fabulously fortunate that he took his time. And we would have discussions. He would call me up and say, what's going on? I got this case and I got that case. And we would, go back and forth on cases. And sometimes we would yell at each other. And each time, I'd say, well, Bob, give me a break. What are you talking about? You don't know nothing. And I'd hang up. And then a couple of days later, I'd pick up the phone and I'd say, Bob, this is Tim. You were right. I was wrong. I'm sorry. But he was just a wonderful person to know. Very big, by the way, on the classics, Greek classics. And he would use that in conversations. But at one point he said to me, he said, you know, we have a sacred trust. And I said, really? What's that? And he tried to explain to me what he meant by a sacred trust. And I took that to heart. The sacred trust that we were talking about was our focus and commitment to racial justice in America. He knew that it wouldn't be over in his lifetime. He knew that that it's going to take generations to move forward to the point where we don't talk about race. So right around that time, people were very, very disheartened. We had a director named Grace Hughes, who just, I'm sure she's a nice person, but she didn't have any commitment to the field. She didn't have any commitment to the casework that was being done. And we were all very disheartened. So at that time, I wrote a paper, and the paper was called Sacred Trust. Here's a copy of Sacred Trust, which I've kept. And I printed this out on my little feeble printer at home. And I then got addresses, private addresses, home addresses, for every conciliation specialist in the agency. And I sent this to them. And I said, I'm not suggesting you adopt this. I'm not suggesting that you believe this. I'm not suggesting that this be something that you want. I'm just telling you, this is where I'm coming from. And basically, what I said to them was, you know, rather than read the whole thing to you, I'll just give you a little highlights. It's just one page. But I said, CRS is about being on the front lines of racial tension and violence in America and making a difference. Look among CRS. CRS responds without hesitation, will go wherever the need is, whenever the need arises, for as long as it takes, and often we're the first ones on the scene. And I got very positive feedback from the field, and very negative feedback from management. Who, you know, their first question was, where was this written? And in the hopes of saying that I used government, you know, stuff. How did you send it? I sent it all private mail. I paid for every stamp because I was fearful that they would say that. But I share that to just to give you a flavor of when you work for the federal government, there are political winds that have to be navigated, that have to be dealt with. And sometimes you can, you know, it's like in basic mediation training, you know, you're going to compromise, are you going to compete, are you going to avoid, you know, those things. And what I chose to do, and what several other conciliation specialists chose to do, was let's try and do our job of getting people to sit and reason together. And so that basically is a theme throughout federal employment. Under Trump, for example, things were, from what I hear from existing staff, not at all supportive. You can't do the job if you can't sit and reason together. You can't sit and reason together if you can't go out and talk with people. You can't go out and talk with people if you have no budget. So the challenges just kept mounting and mounting and mounting. Now with the pandemic, I'm not aware of how much money or how often conciliation specialists could use Zoom or a like thing to say, hi, I'm so-and-so with CRS, and we understand there may be an issue. Do you want to talk about it? And I can't imagine the challenges that conciliation specialists face. You're a face on my computer. I don't know who you are. I don't trust you. Thank you very much, but no. But ideally, what we should have is a staff of people where they go to the location and sit down and do a real assessment with real people in real time, so that A, we can understand what the issues are and whether or not they meet CRS requirements, and B, let people know that if you want to solve something, we can help you. If you don't want our help, then you're going to have to look for other avenues to resolve your conflict.
Mike Johnson McKidd.
That was Mike Johnson, big important guy. It's my brother. He's in Puerto Rico and he's bedridden.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. We call each other every day. The big excitement yesterday was his second day of physical therapy. And he's
Great.
now using 3-pound weights, which he hastened to point out, at home I only use 2 pounds.
Hey, that's 50% more, if you ask me.
Yes.
This is incredible. I mean, there's so much depth here, Tim, that I'd love to dig into a little bit. I really appreciate you highlighting the value of mentorship, the distinction and some occasional tension between administration and those in the field, the political winds, how you got into this. But if you don't mind, I'd love to just rewind a little bit about you and ask you a little bit more about. It seems like your history before joining CRS, after the military, you were really focused on providing support to incarcerated individuals. And I wonder if you can say more about what drove you to that and how that connected to your work at CRS, if it did.
Yes, very much so. As a Ute in New York.
Ute. Okay.
I was back in the early 60s. You had a choice. One could be a hood or a collegian. Collegians, they had crew cuts and flat tops and madras shirts and penny loafers and khakis. Hoods, on the other hand, and I know this will take some imagination on your part, but hoods had way big hair, which they put tons of grease on, and they wore usually dungarees, tight dungarees, and boots, and they smoked massive amounts of cigarettes and drank way too much. The hoods were not academically inclined. So during high school, I ran with the hoods and not the collegians. And then when I was 18, having absolutely no education, but I did have literacy, I must say. And that was based on the fact that when we were preteens, we didn't have a television. So my mother would say, there's nothing better than curling up with a good book and an apple. I don't like apples, but I did read. So I did have literacy. So upon graduating high school, I had nowhere to go. So I went to the Army. And in the Army, there's a certain maturation process that goes on. And when I got back, most of the kids that I knew weren't there anymore. Many of them had fallen prey to drugs, and they were either incarcerated or not doing real well at all. So as a 21-year-old, I had the maturation enough to say, okay, that's not where I need to be. Maybe I should go to college. And then I thought to myself, well, I didn't do very well in high school. In fact, the high school people told me, we're passing you just to get rid of you. We don't want you in our high school. And I said, well, I'm getting a high school diploma. And then I suggested that they perform a sexual act amongst themselves and left. And started to go to college, met a fabulous woman. And let's see, I got out in March, started college that summer, got married that October, had a kid the following June. So now I'm going to college, I'm working, and I've got a daughter and this beautiful woman who I hasten to point out still lives with me. Yeah, I'm shocked as well. So we're together 52 years, and we had 2 fabulous children. But in going to college, that changes your status, changes how people perceive you. So when I did interact with people that I knew in high school, they said, well, you've kind of changed. What do you mean? You're different. What do you mean? Well, I don't know. So I'm going to college. Well, that's fine. You be that. We'll be us. And it occurred to me then, I said, well, there needs to be a link where people can talk to each other and come up with reasonable relationships, so that we don't have this class system of you're this or you're that. That's pretty much high school stuff, which happens today, by the way, in high school. We have all these groups, and so once I got to, I guess, a junior year of college, I thought, well, maybe I should work with inmates. Maybe I should show them that they could do what I did. They don't have to be, this narrow thing. They could widen that up a bit. And so I started working at a local jail as a teacher, and then at a local honor farm, and while continuing my work at college. So that worked out pretty good. And I thought, okay, when I graduate, I got to get a full-time job. And the jail didn't have any full-time jobs. Their answer to treatment programs was have volunteers come in, teach people how to read or something. So I looked around and I found work with the Virginia State Department of Corrections. Well, that's great. I'll go down there, and while I'm there, I'll see if I can't get into Virginia Commonwealth University and get a degree, because the idea being the more degrees you have, the more jobs you can get, blah, blah, blah. And I did that for a while. One of the big things I did while I was at the prison was I created what's called the Community Involvement Group. The Community Involvement Group took inmates out of the prison into the community, where they performed certain projects, cleanups, that kind of thing. And they said, oh, this is great. It also involved getting people from the community to come into the prison and talk to the Community Involvement Group. So this, again, trying to narrow that gap between, I'm a bad guy and you're a good guy. And let's kind of see if we can't meld that together. And that worked out very well. In fact, the Community Involvement Group was the Program of the Year or something. It was mentioned by the American Correctional Association. So we did pretty good with that. And that kind of led me to continue the process. What can I do to spread this around? Then the state planning agency job came available. And I said, this is great. I can now take these kinds of ideas and share them statewide, which I thought would be reasonable. And once I got to that point and was there for a couple of years, in fact, I was there when my fabulous wife came, and she came walking down we had a hallway and I had a little office, and she came walking down the hallway with a grin this big, because this was 7 years after we had had our daughter Noreen. And she said, guess what? I said, what? I'm pregnant. So that allowed for a huge celebration. And we then produced Michael Johnson. First we had Noreen Johnson, then now we got Michael Johnson. Just around that time, just while she was pregnant, I got a job with the federal government in Washington, D.C. So what I did was I moved by myself up to Northern Virginia, where I made a deal with the Department of Corrections. I said, you let me sleep in the guards' quarters of one of your little jails up there, and I'll teach the staff various things. And they said, oh, good idea. So that's what I did. I slept there, got up, went into Washington, D.C., did my job, came back, and had dialogues and training programs with the staff. And that worked out great. Then in May, Michael came along, our son Michael, and a few months later, we found a townhouse to live in and rest in, and thank God we all got back together. Again. And while I was with LEAA, I think I was called a criminal justice specialist. My focus was to help people who were getting grants look at ways to provide less division between convicted people and unconvicted people. And throughout all of that experience, it occurred to me that most of the convicted people I was dealing with were people of color. And in the East Coast, the rates of incarceration are disproportionate between white and black. Doesn't mean you don't have white inmates, you do, but you have a higher percentage of the population is going to be African American or Latino. You hardly get any Mormons, you hardly get any Jews, you hardly get any Quakers, right? You get mostly poor people who are not connected or bonded to other things, bonded like to a job, to a family, to a church, to a synagogue, to a temple. Those people who are bonded have more to lose with bad behavior than people who are not bonded. There's a whole big thing called the bonding theory that talks about this. And so when I got to LEA, I thought, this is great. I was able to go to different states and talk to large groups of people about, what they could do and encourage them about how to do what they're doing. LEAA then died. The politics, kind of went down like this. And I had to look around and find something else to be. And the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention became a depository for old LEAA people. And so I went there. again, trying to use my position to advance communication between the haves and the have-nots, between the people who think they counted and the people who thought they didn't, to try and see if we couldn't do, and this was before Johnson, sit and reason together. So I very much identified with that. One of the things that I did with OJGDP was I came up with this idea. We should let people in the states know they're doing a good job. The way to do that was to give them a certificate. How much would it cost to develop a certificate? We could print it. We had a printing office. We could print it. We could say, Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention, project of value and worth, and write some stuff on. So I proposed that idea, and this again gives you an idea of the bureaucracy. I'm down here, and I proposed it to this guy, right, who then took credit for it and proposed it to this guy, okay, who then took credit for it and proposed it to this guy. But it worked out very well, because what it did was, and we didn't take responsibility for choosing who the projects were. We asked the state to nominate their best project. And then we would look at that and say, okay. And then we would go out and give them a reward. Now the uppers thought this was a great idea because it gave them a chance to go to the places to present the awards. And I can remember, being like a little kid at an airport going, everybody gets a plane ride but me. But it worked out very well. And again, it fits with this theme of, can we bring people closer together? And they said, well, why should we tell somebody in Dubuque they're doing a good job? So not only do you tell the people in Dubuque, but then you share that to all the other states and say, look what Dubuque is doing. Isn't that a great thing? Again, pulling people together. And unfortunately, again, politics being what it was, being one of the five, I had to leave, and that got me to CRS, where, I immediately adopted and accepted and supported the idea of, let's get people to sit down and reason together. Because when you think about it, racism is based on a social construct that has no meaning. Right? So, well, white people are better than black people. Well, okay. Colin Powell is smarter than I am. He's a Republican, but he's smarter than I am. Right? Oprah Winfrey is smarter than I am. Michelle Obama is smarter than I am. Barack Obama he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He's smarter than I am. Okay. So if we're going to talk about intelligence, black people are more intelligent than white people. No. And Jack Dempsey could have knocked out Muhammad Ali. Just silly, stupid arguments like that. And so it just occurred to me that if we could all, like, what was his name? George King, the fellow that they beat up so bad in LA, the police banged on him.
Rodney King.
Rodney, thank you, Rodney. Can't we all just get along? And I thought, well, okay, let's see what we can do. And so CRS was like an answer to my prayers for that. But nothing comes pure, and nothing comes easy. So you have to say, okay, you're giving me this spot to do things, but you're going to load me with requirements about how to do it, when to do it, who to do it with, things like that. And the idea there is, okay, and this sort of speaks to one of your questions, was how do you deal with the bureaucracy? And my advice to staff now and to staff then was learn the language of the bureaucracy. Put yourself in their place. What do they want? Right? And just like in basic conflict resolution, right? What are the issues? What do they want? Okay, what are the positions? What do they think is going to get them what they want? Right? Go beyond that to interest. Right? Why do they want what they want? Right? And in doing that, I said to myself, okay, I'm all for sitting down and reasoning together. I'm all for getting people to deal with each other. Management, on the other hand, is all about reports. It's all about show me documentation. Okay. What do they need for documentation? Well, they have to have an alert. Okay. What does that consist of? Well, it has to say what the issues are. Okay. So how can I write that? I can write that by saying, according to media reports, according to input from, according to reports of, blah, 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 there may be jurisdictional issues involved in this situation. How hard is that? All right. So you have, and I don't know if you remember, there used to be a way on computers, on the typewriter rather, you could make a stock answer. Right? I can't remember what they called it, but I would just go to my little computer thing. And
Well, this is perfect, by the way, because I would love for you to take me through a case, perhaps a case that was engaging for folks to hear about it, sharing what you are comfortable sharing. And so maybe you want to start with the alert, describing this process generically, and then take me through how it worked in a memorable, engaging case. But I've not used a typewriter since middle school, so I don't.
Yeah, well, I still put stuff in an icebox, so work with me. So if I learn the language of what they want, it's pretty easy to stick it in there. And the language during my time was make an alert, make an assessment, and then do conciliation reports. That was it. Now they had rules. They said you must do X number of alerts per year. You must do Y number of assessments per year. Because you could close on alert. You could close a case on alert. You could also close a case on assessment, not jurisdictional, parties not involved or interested, whatever. And then you had to do conciliation report. Then they said, when I was in New York, they said, you must do 15 cases, completed cases a year. To be satisfactory, you must do 15 cases a year. And I said, okay. And I think it went from June to July, I can't remember. But about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months into that year, I had completed 15 cases. So I went to my regional director, who was a woman named Tommy Jones. And when she died, I think the perfume industry slumped because she didn't go like this with perfume. She went like this. And so I went into it and I said, well, Tommy, this is my 15th completed case. Oh, that's wonderful. I said, okay, I'm going to go home now. I'll see you next July. Oh, no. But no, she would say. Just to kind of demonstrate the artificialness of, we have to do this, this, and this. Because that's what another part of CRS is focused on. Show me the reports. Show me data that I can bring to Congress and say, we did blank, 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 blank. So I thought, okay, what you need to do is figure out how to speak the language they want to hear, but still get your job of sitting down and reasoning together done. I would do, well, sounds like I'm bragging. I would do a lot of cases. And the reason I would do a lot of cases is because I wanted to do, I thought this was important. I thought this was, this was my contribution. This was my shot. So at the end of a term, I would have racked up 40 or 50 cases that year. There were regions, fully staffed regions, who racked up less cases than I did by myself. But to their, in their defense, it was easier for me to do cases because I was in the New York region. So I could do all of New Jersey. I could do a lot of the New York metropolitan area, which accounted for a lot of cases, without really much travel. But if you're in Denver, it takes you a day to get somewhere, and a day to do it, and a day to get back. And so less cases. If I know the language that they want to hear, and I know the things that they want to tick off, I can put that in my reports. I can make my reports useful to headquarters. Then at one point, I left the field and went to headquarters, had a job at headquarters, which just reinforced, what I was saying. And I would call people up and I would say, change that report, say this, this, this. Why should I do that? That's my report. I said, yeah, I know, but that's not what they want to hear. And, and it just fed the bureaucracy, if you will. And so I said earlier, we did lots of training. So as a response to a problem, we said, all right, we'll train. Then they said, well, training is not mediation. So we're not counting those as cases. So I said, okay, all right, that's fine. So now, instead of calling it training, call it interaction between disputants. Because what I would do is I would ask people in the community to sit down with people from the police department or the school or whatever, and then say, okay, let's talk about bias-based policing. Let's talk about how communities can better able to interact with police. Let's talk about, blah, blah, blah. It was training, for sure. That involved two groups of people sitting down and reasoning together. And that's what they wanted to hear. So I developed several training guides that were, you're a professor, is that correct? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. If you're going to go in and do conflict resolution 101 for a group of freshmen, you're pretty well set. You could pretty well do it without a whole
Just
lot.
Did it Monday and Tuesday for a group, right? A couple hours of prep.
So now you've got that down. Right? And you could say, boom, 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 boom. Well, same thing with me. So a lot of times, people would, people in this jurisdiction would talk to people in that jurisdiction and say, well, call Tim Johnson. He can get this. And so you organize people sitting down and reasoning together. You just didn't call it what you used to call it. It's the same deal, though. And that, that worked well for me. It worked very well because, each year I would get this high number of cases completed, and they would say, well, okay, Jim, you're outstanding this year. In the federal government, they have those evaluations, which mean about this much. But they would say, you're outstanding. And then if they yelled at me, I would say, wait a minute, I'm outstanding. What are you kidding me? So it worked out well. But the point is that if you're going to work in a large organization like CRS, learn the language, learn what people in headquarters want, what management wants, and make that part of what you do. And if you can do that, then you're fine. You asked about a case. I'll give you an example.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, I'd love to get more detail and context about what would happen in a particular case, one that was engaging.
I'll give you two examples. One which I withdrew from, and one which I saw through completion. In one, I was contacted by leadership in the minority community because they knew who CRS was. And they said, we are considering a strike. I said, okay, who are you going to strike against? They said, we're going to strike against the entire city. This is a mid-sized city. And had their own baseball team, so they were cool. I said, well, when you say you're going to, strike against the city, well, first of all, can you tell me why? Yes, because the mayor, and then they listed a bunch of things. Doesn't hire us, and doesn't focus on us, doesn't respond to us, things like that. Okay, and what will your strike consist of? We are no longer shopping in any stores within the city limits. We are no longer using city transportation. And things like that to affect the economy. I said, well, have you tried to talk to city leadership about this? They won't talk to us. I said, so have you tried to talk to the mayor? Won't talk to us. Would it be okay if I reached out to the mayor to see if we couldn't sit down and reason together? Well, it's not going to do you any good, but you can try. So I met with the mayor. Very dynamic guy. Had a big plaque on his wall from the Army. He had been an airborne soldier, a guy who jumped out of planes, and so we traded war stories. I worked with that group and that kind of thing. And we established a very nice relationship, which, Conciliation 101, establish a relationship. And I said, here's what I'm hearing from leadership in your community. And these leaders included representatives from this organization, that organization, blah, blah, blah. And what they would like is to sit down and deal with these issues. And he said, I absolutely want to do that. I'll go there, they can come here, or we can go to a neutral spot. I absolutely want to do that. Let's see if we can't resolve it. So I went back to the community and I said, well, as luck would have it, the mayor is interested in talking to you about this. And the people I was dealing with said, well, we don't care. We're not going to deal with him. I said, well, what's the point? And somebody said, well, the point is we want him out, and we're going to strike, and we're going to get people to vote for us. And I said, well, now you're talking about a political thing here. You're not talking about something that's jurisdictional to us. I'm out. And I walked away. Now, I was not able, just by policy, to talk to the mayor ever again, or to talk to the press. So that was just a case where I could not do anything for that community because they already chosen another way. Different case.
So, do you mind if I ask you a few follow-up questions about that
Sure.
case first? So, is this a case where you did an alert, found some news stories, and reached out, or did you said they reached out to you?
They reached out to me, which I alerted. I was
Okay.
contacted my leadership from with allegations of it appears to be jurisdictional, move to assessment.
Okay. And so then the rest of the conversation was all part of your assessment. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay. And then the case was closed because you didn't have jurisdiction
right.
under the initial authorization, the pre James Byrd, Matthew Shepard
Yes.
of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So that makes sense. When you had these initial conversations with the minority group in the city that was planning this strike, this citywide strike, were these conversations over the phone? Did you chat with multiple stakeholders? You said you met with the mayor in person, so that was clearly part of your assessment. But were all your meetings in person,
Yes.
or did you already have a pre-existing relationship with the minority group?
No, no, I never met any of them, had never been in that city. But when I got to the assessment stage, I had the wherewithal to go to the city, which required, I guess it was about a 3 or 4 hour trip out. And I met with the community that night, spent the night in a hotel, met with the mayor that morning, and then met with the community again that following evening, and said, thanks, no thanks. And then drove back to my home. So because staying in that second night was not economically sensible. So I got home around 12:30 or something. But again, that's part of the deal. That's part of the limitations that we have. Some people would say, well, I would have just stayed the next day and used the following day as a travel day. But my focus wasn't on how easy can I make it. It was more on how much more can I do. And so, and the following day, after coming home, got up the next day, and I wrote the closure report. So it all, I closed on assessment based on, that this was not jurisdictional, this was political.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I appreciate you highlighting all of that. Just one more follow-up question about the mayor. When you tried to gain entry into that conversation, to chat with the mayor, was it easy to get through to him to have that meeting, or were there specific? Was there a challenge in that conversation? Did you have to highlight confidentiality aspects of CRS to get into that conversation with the mayor?
No, I had that conversation, but to get the appointment was not a problem at all. I called the office of the mayor and said, I'm Tim Johnson. I'm with the United States Department of Justice. I'd like to set up a meeting with the mayor about concerns and problems that we've become aware of. Would that be possible? And their response was, what time?
Great. I appreciate that. Your articulation that you just said you're represented from DOJ, and the mayor's office was open to the conversation about that topic. I appreciate that follow up. So I'd be delighted to hear about. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
One of the things about being with CRS, we had little identification cards. Little flaps that said Department of Justice. You open it up and there's your picture and stuff. And that gave you authority. That gave you, people stopped and said, "Oh, okay." As an example, I was on lunch in Little Italy, New York, and minding my own business, not dealing with anything. And here comes a car, and followed directly by another car, and then beep, 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 beep. And this front car stops, and 3 guys get out of the second car. one with a baseball bat, right? And the guy in the front car gets out. The guy in the front car is African-American. These three guys are clearly Italian, and they're yelling epithets at the African-American guy. You blah, 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 blah. And so I had my little suit and tie on, right? And so I reached into my pocket and I pulled out my credentials and I walked between them. And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. And I held up the little flap. The Department of Justice, you guys don't want to be doing this. This is not the time or place for this. You really need to get back in your car and get out of here. And I closed it and I said to the African American, I said, you need to get back in your car and whatever this is about, forget it, go. And so the African American was clearly relieved because he knew he was going to get his ass kicked, and he gets back in the car. The three guys, you know, they assumed I was like FBI or something, which I'm not, and they just kind of, you guys are everywhere. And they got in their car and they drove away. But just having that cachet, that you know, I'm with the Department of Justice, you know, gave me the, I don't know, the wherewithal to be able to do something like that. Leaving the department, when I retired, I missed it. I missed that. I missed being able to go anywhere, talk to anybody about anything. Oh, that's my badge. Oh, look at that. Oh, well, now I'll listen to you. And it takes a little bit of getting used to becoming a regular human being. If you talk to retired police officers, they'll tell you the same thing. They'll say, you know, I'm not that guy anymore. I'm, you know, if I'm a cop in New York and I move to Oklahoma, nobody cares. And I did take that responsibility, and I enjoyed that authority very, very much.
But it's really amazing how you use that authority to intervene in this, you know, this little conflict while you're eating lunch. It's such an illustration of how the badge is a valuable tool to gain entry into conversations.
Very much so.
I do wonder, generally, once you were able to gain entry, did you distance yourself from DOJ in some conversations? Because you know, some folks know the DOJ is an investigatory unit, or DOJ, you know, BIPOC communities might be concerned that DOJ is really going to use their authority to treat Black and brown individuals in an inappropriate manner. So how did that tension work? So you get in and you put it away, or what happened?
Well, that presented, the fact that I'm white presented challenges, and the fact that I was with the federal government presented challenges. You know, hi, I'm from the federal government, I'm here to help is, you know, sort of a joke. So the way I got around that was saying, I'm Tim Johnson. I told him that first, I'm Tim Johnson. And the federal government has different levels of how to respond to things. Right? The best level is you. The best level is you sitting down with people here, not from Washington, not from out of town, but you guys sitting down and coming up with your own solution. Right? That's the best way, not the only way. I can help you with the best way. Right? I can help you sit down and reason together. If you don't want that, then you can go to the U.S. attorney and say, we want to file a suit. U.S. attorney may or may not accept that. U.S. attorney, you know, just recently in the news, you know, you looked at all the different times that the U.S. Department of Justice declined to pursue cases against various former administration officials. So you could do that. Or if you want, you could get an attorney and sue and see if, you know, you might, you know, get something out of that. However, if you do that, that's going to cost you money. it's going to take a long time. And it's not really going to do anything to change the way people feel about each other. So if you want to give a shot to what I think is the very best solution, which is you, I can help you do that. And most of the time they went for it. Most of the time they said, well, okay. Sometimes not so much. I had a case, one of the people I worked with is a fellow named Moses Jones. Moses was an African-American, and sometimes they would send us out together for a case. And we went to a case in a small city in New York where they were outraged because the allegation was that the jail personnel hung a young African-American inmate. And they said, we ain't putting up with no lynching and things like that. So they had a big meeting in the basement of a church. And they, during the assessment or the alert stage, the assessment stage, they said, well, you can come and talk to us at that meeting. So Moses and I showed up and in the basement. It's very crowded. And the minister, whoever was saying, we are against this, we're against that, and we don't want this, we don't want that, and we're going to demand justice. And we're looking for ways to do that. And now keep in mind that I was the only white person in the room, okay? And one of the two or three that had a suit and tie on. Moses had a suit and tie on, I had a suit and tie on. And I think the minister had a suit and tie on. And finally, the minister said, well, we got a white man from the Department of Justice come down here and talk to us. And I looked around like this. I put, me? Oh, is it me? And that was not the only time that Moses and I were in that kind of a situation. We were in another meeting, quite similar, and somebody in one side of the room was saying, and Moses is standing right next to me. He said, and this guy said, who the white man? And Moses said, yeah, who that white man? and so, if you inject a little humor into it, people, kind of will loosen up a little bit. But things like that, you tell each other and you kind of get over a little bit of, this resistance. And the resistance is real. You've got people who have been discriminated against for their entire lives. It's always by white people, and that they have not had one positive relationship or anything with anybody white. It's always been bad. So it's very difficult to say, I'm a good guy. I'm not a bad guy. I'm here to work with you, not at you. And so one of the things that all conciliators for the government have to do is get over that. I'm from the government and you're not. You have to say, the government has this very small window of opportunity, and clearly it's not large enough. You've got less than 30 people covering the entire country now. We had more. We had about 50 when I was there. And not nearly enough, not nearly enough. And what the agency can do now is respond to the biggest outburst that exists. And what they should be doing is responding to the smallest things. And if they respond to the small things, the big things don't happen. Solve the little problems, the big problems don't happen. But again, now we're talking budgets and politics and why should I give this guy money? And, if you look at Rand Paul, to mention a name, we don't need CRS. We don't need, this federal intervention. Well, nobody else is doing it. We're the only ones doing it. So getting over the humps is sometimes a big challenge.
That's great.
If you don't get over the hump with reason, get over the hump with money. So, and get over the hump with money by saying, well, you can solve this here and now for free, confidentially, right now. Or you can pay a lot of money, maybe get something, maybe not. So it's up to you.
I like that. It's what you said is very succinct and concrete, and I appreciate how you're saying that the best level to work with through the federal government is you, and I can help you do that. That's a really nice framing, and one I think that I might tell my mediation students this coming semester when they're working with the parties. That's great. I like it a lot. So I appreciate that. I had interrupted you. You had told me about the case with the minority community, and you met with the mayor, and then realized this was a political issue. And there was no jurisdiction. You were about to move on to a second case that you worked on to conclusion. So if you could take me through that, that would be wonderful.
Met with the leadership of the African American community in a town. They had a list of grievances against the police department. Bias-based policing, lack of response, targeting youth, those kinds of things. So I alerted that, and then to assess it, I reached out to leadership in the African American community. And when I reached out to the leadership, I would say, well, okay, Minister so-and-so, who else is a leader in your community, in the African American community, besides yourself? Well, we got the NAACP guy. Oh, great. What's his name? Well, Joe Blow. Okay. You think it'd be all right if you and I and Joe met? Because I'm sure he shares some of these things. Yeah. Can you think of any other leaders that, ought to be at that meeting between you and me to figure out, very specifically what all the issues are? Oh, yeah. So we get a list. And then I would say, all right, can we set a date, say next Tuesday in the evening, or, whenever. Usually the meetings with community were in the evening because people had jobs. And then sometimes my initial contact would contact the other leaders. Sometimes I would have to contact them. But the idea being, I don't want to deal with just one voice. I want as many organizations within the community as possible to agree that this is an issue. So I did that, and I went to the town, met with them, overcame some initial, we don't trust the government, we don't trust the Department of Justice, and your rules are old-fashioned and not useful, and the Civil Rights Act didn't work, and things like that. And then sell them on the idea of helping them solve their own problem. And it's a selling job. I think a lot of your students might think, well, I'll become a mediator, sit down in my office and wait for people to come in. No, you got to sell it. You got to, and we're not doing a very good job of that. Culturally, we're not doing a very good job. But once I did that, I said, okay, I'm going to write down all these issues, right? Because I want to be able to present them to the police department. Okay, then what? Then what's going to happen? Well, they're probably going to have some answers or some denials, or in some cases they might agree with you. I don't know, but let me do that. Let me go and talk. And then I contacted Chief of Police. Hi, Tim Johnson, Department of Justice. I'd like to talk to you. Are you with Civil Rights? No, I'm not with Civil Rights, because then they fear the consent decree. Well, who are you? What is this? Then you explain, with this little window of opportunity, and we can do this without publicity. We don't need, a bunch of local, Geraldo Rivera's to come in and say, wow, this is the worst thing ever. Let's be reasonable. And the chief said, okay. I said, all right, great. Let me come and sit down with you and your staff, whoever, your administrative staff or whoever you want. And if you want to involve city managers or whomever. It's up to you. I want to talk to you. Now, you tell me who else should be in the room. That's fine with me. Went and sat down with the chief. He had a captain, a lieutenant, and some sort of planner. I can't remember what his job was, but he wasn't with the police department. He's like a city planner. And I said, okay, I met with some people, representative of the African-American community. These are the things that they said. Now, in my experience, these kinds of allegations are based on either rumors or one incident, not normal operation. Oh, that's right. Yeah, we agree with that. But they still exist. These problems still exist. So, for example, a police officer approaches a car for a routine traffic stop and stands behind the front window. Doesn't go right up to the window and say, "Hi, I'm Officer Friendly." Stands behind the front windows, sort of parallel with the back seat, not the front seat. And you have to turn around like this to talk to him. That's just rude, isn't it? This is what the community would say. Right? And the police officer very often has his hand on the butt of his pistol. Well, now that's just intimidating. Why is that happening? Well, if you think about it, you say, okay, I'm a cop, I'm stopping a car, I don't know who's in it, don't know what the situation is. I better be careful. I better be very careful, because there have been times when police officers have been shot and killed during a traffic stop, where the person in the car might be escaping from a scene of a crime or whatever, or might be nuts and has a gun right next to him. And as soon as the cop shows his face, he goes bang. There was a Maryland State trooper by the name of Wolf who 40 or 50 years ago, that's exactly what happened to him. So now, when you explain things like that, people in the community go, well, I don't have a gun. I'm not that person. And then you follow up with, okay, but how does he know? How does the cop know before he gets to you? Right? Now, there's no excuse for the cop to use derogatory terms. No excuse at all. Right? And when that happens, it should be reported, blah, blah, blah. So by going back and forth with these kinds of scenarios with the police folks, they feel a little more comfortable in saying, okay, well, bad things sometimes happen, but that's not our policy and that's not what we want. And then I followed that up with, well, how about this? How about you get some folks from the police department, some line officers from the police department, patrol officers, say 5, and I'll get some people from the community and we'll sit down, we'll talk about these very specific allegations, about what the police think about that, what the community thinks about that, and how they can come together to resolve those kinds of issues. Do you think that a patrol officer wants the community to feel like he is an intrusion, that he is a stormtrooper, that he is an invader? Or does the cop want the community to feel like he's part of the community, not apart from it? And if you're in the community, what is necessary for the cop to get to that point of having them feel they're part of, not apart from the community? Let them sit down and reason together about how to do that. Then come up with a set of recommendations to go back to the chief of police, sometimes written down as an agreement, sometimes just notes jotted down, and see where to go from there. Oh, okay, we'll do that. And so you do that, and now they have a reasonable platform on which to talk. So sometimes they'll say, well, we want the police to understand us better. Okay, great. What should they know? We're good people. All of you? Are all white people good? I don't think so. Charlie Manson was nasty. You know, John Dillinger was a killer. Well, these are bad people. At the time, I wanted to say Richard Nixon, but I didn't. Uh, 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 but you know, to be reasonable, we have to you know, allow people to come to their own conclusions. It does know another thing that I would say to folks is I would say, well, we can go to Congress and Congress can pass a law. It'll be a law, right? That there'll be no segregation anymore. Now, when I was born, there was segregation. Right? When I was born, Black people literally had to sit in the back of the bus. Right? That there were laws on the books that said white and Black people couldn't marry. Right? That was the law. So we can change the laws. In 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act. Did it solve every problem? No. Did it change everybody's attitude? No. How can we do that? We can do that by sitting down and reasoning together to say, okay, from now on, I'm going to understand my responsibilities as a citizen in police contact, as a police officer in contact with the community. And then you work from there. Doesn't mean that the problem is resolved forever and ever, and everybody's going to sit down and sing "We Shall Overcome." What it means is that at that time, at that period of time, those people got a chance to sit down and talk to each other and come to some resolutions that allowed for peace to continue, which I think is what CRS is best at. Now, CRS is also, throughout our history, we've written massive memorandums of understanding. Pat Glynn did one in Ohio. Massive, 30, 40 pages. And she did one in Ferguson back in the, I think Ferguson, back in the 70s. And then you go, well, did that change anything? No, because then you still have cops, shooting each other.
I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So, one of your colleagues, Pat Flynn, would write memorandums of understanding between police and community for police and community interactions. But what I think I'm hearing you say is that didn't change perceptions and attitudes between police and minority communities. Whereas having people come in a conversation, having you facilitate a conversation between these handful of police officers and handful of community members who felt disparaged in some way by police, whether it's rumor or actual, that actually led to more durable solutions and changed some attitudes, whereas the MOUs did not.
Yeah, I would have to say both work, both change attitudes. One is organic and the other is artificial. It's artificial in that 2 years later, the people who point to the consent decree or memorandum of understanding or whatever weren't involved in drafting it, weren't involved in signing it, really don't care. So whereas the people who were involved at a more visceral level, more direct level, have a better way of handling things, have a better way of understanding things. Both the memorandum of understanding and the getting together only last as long as people continually sit down and talk about it. So you would hope that that the police and the community leadership would continue the conversations, would continue to talk. The chief of police in Newark, New Jersey, and I can't remember his name, he later became a big deal in one of the national organizations. He had a really smart idea. He went around and tried to identify community leaders. And community leader, by the way, is people other people listen to. Not necessarily a minister, but sometimes a minister, sometimes a barber shop. But let's get people other people listen to. And then when bad things happen, he would have his cops go out and get those people, physically get those people, bring them into the headquarters and talk to them. Here's what happened. Here's what we're doing. Here's what you need to tell your people that you influence. Absent that, you have rumors. And one particular case that this worked out perfectly was cop goes up to a car full of African-American youth, hand on his weapon, and is talking to the kids, slipped, right? And the gun came out, went off, and killed the driver of the car. And he slipped, right? And rather than assume that the kid was assassinated by a racist police officer, what the chief did was he called those people in, said, here's what happened. We're investigating it. We're not shirking our duties. If it happened the way the cops say it did, we'll figure that out with forensics and location of the bullet or whatever. This was before the cameras, by the way. And we take full responsibility. What that means is that, it was a wrongful death, and the city will take full responsibility for that. So now all these leaders come out and they say, all right, something happened, but we got the word from the chief, here's what's going to go on. And so calm down. And he avoided a lot of destruction that way. But keep in mind that all of that was based on the premise of sitting down and reasoning together. And we had in CRS, they still do. We have.
Do you mind if I pause on a Newark example just for a second?
Sure.
Because it's a lovely example of reasoning together, as you highlighted it. And it seems like the chief had built relationships with those leaders, whether they're official or unofficial, in the community to transparently spread information to key leaders so that the information could travel back out in a trusted way. Rather than hearing from the chief, they were hearing from the barbershop or the religious official or the imam or whomever that was trusted in the community. Maybe it's the football coach, right? Did you, with that chief in New Jersey, did CRS have a relationship with that chief, help him work on her work on this program? Could you say a little bit more about that relationship, if one exists?
We knew who he was. He knew who we were. He did this on his own. He did this by himself, and we use it as a model. When
Smart,
yeah. We talk to other chiefs.
It's great because he's based on what you've said. You can solve these problems on your own, and by highlighting that for other communities, to say, look, this is the way one chief did it. You can do that. You can do something similar. It's just one example.
Exactly right.
Just for a second, I wanted to go back to I appreciate the MOU and engaged conversations, distinction between the community leaders and the police. Do you know of any communities that you've worked in or your colleagues have worked in by name or just generically that formalize that process into something that worked for the long term, for more than just 2 or 3 years of leaders meeting to express their concerns with police who are on the front lines? Is there a sustainable model for that process, or were there particular reasons why they disintegrated and the model was just didn't last longer than a couple of months or a couple of years?
Right. I am unaware of one that has lasted 10, 15, 20 years. And the rationale behind that is that the people involved aren't there anymore. that the people who created it from the community, the people who were involved in it from the government aren't there anymore. They just aren't. You're familiar with police community relations, all right? And we thought, oh, that's a great idea, you know, Tetronowitz and all those other guys, and they came up with a really good idea. And some police departments shifted their philosophy from one of, quote, law enforcement, unquote, to one of police community relations. Okay, so the philosophy shifted while that chief was there. And when that chief left, it drifted back. Right? Because it's easier to not be involved with the community, either as a principal of a high school or a chief of police or a mayor. And the mayor changes. Now we're going to go the other way, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. So I'm not aware of any of it lasting longer than the people involved, which is a shame.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder, you were talking about the community where that took place, and you had talked about the alert, you talked about the assessment, and you talked about how you brought people together. Would you consider that a formal mediation when you were facilitating conversations between the 5 police and the 5 individuals, or part of your role as a conciliator? You're smiling, so
I'm smiling because I consider it mediation. I consider mediation is getting people at the table to communicate, getting people to recognize what the other's positions and interests are. Right? I say that's mediation. The agencies did not agree. In order for it to be a mediation, you had to have either a memorandum of understanding or a mediation agreement, which, you know, documented, if you will, wrote down these agreements and was signed and notarized and all sorts of things like that, which I think deterred people from the process rather than encourage people in the process. You know, oh, now I got to sign something. Oh, now it's an official. And in all my years, I probably did 10 mediations. And each time you had to write it, and then you had to send it into the Office of General Counsel, who then reviewed it and then changed it and then sent it back to you. And then you had to send it back to the people. You know, they would edit it. And so it became cumbersome. And when people in a family have a fight, you know, they're not looking for a document, they're looking for a resolution. And so they didn't want to go through all this rigmarole. If you look at a couple who gets divorced and then they fight about child custody, and well, the court says you can have 2 hours supervised every other Thursday or whatever. That's not really resolving the issue. If you want to really resolve the issue, you got to resolve it between the mother and the father and say, you know, our relationship didn't work out. I recognize that you still want to have a relationship with your son or your daughter. What can we do to make that happen? And those, I think those kinds of agreements last longer than, you know, court documents. And in many cases with the divorced people, the documents just become an obstacle, and one of the other parents just says, forget it, I'll just move on, which does a disservice to the kid.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Thank you for that. I wonder, just to go back a little bit, for either of the 2 scenarios you described, or generally, what type of preparation would you do to go into the community, to conduct an assessment, to engage with stakeholders and
Well, I would do as much research about who's in the community, what the population is, what the employment is, what the economic situations are, whether or not there are very specific white areas and black areas. Um, I'd look at the schools um, to see if there were disproportionate things happening in the schools. Um, so I would have as much information as I could get walking into the assessment. But I would always ask questions during the assessment. I would say, what else is going on? What other issues do you see? Um, and then, I was laughing about what I call mediation, what they call mediation. Um, I would um, purposely word my reports so that it it gave the people in headquarters fodder for reporting back to Congress. I would say uh, facilitated contact between disputants. Uh, you know, facilitated agreements among disputants, those kinds of things, just so that they got what they needed, I got what I needed, um, and to move forward like that.
In a case like the one you've been describing, uh, where the police meet with the residents, what would a final report look like? You previously described 4 stages as alert, assessment, reports on what you were doing or how you did it, and then a final report. What would a final report look like?
One report would say, we review that we assessed, we alerted and assessed, and made contact with, facilitated agreements, and one of those agreements was that the line police and community would meet together to examine issues. The community met with the police department. The following issues were examined. The following agreements to those issues included, this, that, or the other thing. Very often, it would include um, police reaching out to community organizations to explain citizen rights, to explain police rights, and that kind of thing. And sometimes I would then say, wait a minute, Tim, you can get 2 cases out of this. And again, I would go back to the same one and alert, that um, police needed technical assistance on developing training program for community. And then I would go in and do it all over again and show them how to do that. And like we said earlier, excuse me, if you are a trainer, if you're comfortable with developing lesson plans and whatnot, it's pretty easy to walk in and say, okay, here's 10 things you're going to do. I'm involved with a restorative justice practice here in my area, and we base our stuff on the International Institute of Restorative Practices out of Pennsylvania, and they say we got 5 questions. What happened? What were you thinking? What are you thinking now? Who got hurt? And what are you going to do about it? And so I recently was asked if I could do a refresher course on that. And in most of the refreshers, they say just ask the 5 questions. So in my deal, I said, well, what happens during one of these processes? One of the common things is people ask for an apology. So we should be able to articulate that. So in my little lesson plan, I say, what are the parts of an apology? What are the do's and don'ts of an apology? So if you're going to facilitate, something like that, you should know what to look for, and what to do instead of apologizing, and what mindset you should have, what principles you should have. and how you should listen. And then if is that all you're going to do? You're going to ask the 5 questions. Boom, now you're done. You should go beyond the 5 questions. How do you do that? No, I don't know. So what I did was I wrote beyond the 5 questions, which includes talking about personal responsibility, your authentic self, trying to find out who you are now, who you're going to be, and pointing out that if you are a juvenile, your brain is not done. Right? And I also introduced the word Yacoy, Y-A-I-C-O-Y.
I don't have a clue.
Yeah, I made it up. And Yacoy means you are in charge of you, which focuses on the responsibility piece. And then I say, well, they'll say, we'll say, what happened? And they'll say, I got angry. You say, you got angry? And this is out of a training piece that I'm going to do next week. You got angry. So you got mad, you lost control, you blew your stock, you blew your top, you went through the roof, you went nuts, you freaked out, you went off the deep end, you snapped, you lost your temper, you blew a fuse, you flipped out, you went bonkers, you went ape, you got upset, you were uncontrollable, you lost it, you blew up, you blew your cool, you went berserk, you went crazy, you had a fit. Is that close to what you're saying to me? And, all of a sudden they think they're talking to George Carlin. And then they say, yeah, and I say, what's the common denominator? The common denominator is you weren't in control, something else was. The other guy who made you mad, the situation, whatever it was, you weren't in control. So you don't want that. And then the final thing, which I found amusing, is the brain. The brain not, being fully developed yet. And I say, there's a word, neuromaturation, which has to do with the growth of the brain. And so the brain is made up of gray matter and white matter. Gray matter stores all the information, while white matter forms the connections between different parts of the brain. And the gray matter, excuse me, gray matter matures at about 11 or 12. White matter doesn't mature till you're in your 20s. Right? The title to that particular slide is White Matter Matters. All of that to say that if we don't continuously talk to one another and say, what I found, like I didn't know about the white matter, gray matter thing. I knew, differences between the brain, but I wasn't able to articulate it quite like that quote does. And the quote is, nowhere near scientific. It's just white matter, gray matter. Then talk about the abagum data or whatever it is. It's meant to talk to kids. So how do you do that? So one of the things I tried throughout my career with CRS is, can we share our experiences somehow? Can the conciliation specialist in California explain to me what they did in a particular case? And what were the obstacles? How did you overcome those obstacles? What were the things you learned? What should I do if I'm faced with that situation? What's the best way to blank, 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 blank? And CRS was very remiss in allowing that to happen. At one point, they said, no conciliation specialist in a region can talk to any other conciliation specialist in any other region. We cheated, and we called each other anyway. But that attitude was, one of separation, not unison. And you weren't allowed to talk to You know, if you were a regional director, you weren't allowed to talk to a conciliation specialist from another region. That has to be done by the regional director from that region. You know, those kinds of silly bureaucratic obstacles that really deterred advancement rather than encouraged it. You know, that was again one of the reasons I wrote the Sacred Trust thing. Let's all recognize that each one of us has some really good ideas, and you know, one way to explain CRS is a really good idea that was had by a bunch of people in the 1960s that allowed for the creation of an agency to make peace. What a good idea that is, right? And the foundation of that idea is the people we come into contact with, not an authoritarian, we're going to make peace, but a service of we're going to help you in your particular, you know, deal to make peace. Might be different in Dubuque than it is in New York. We don't know. It's the people involved. And I always say there's no right or wrong answer. You know, the answer is whatever you say it is. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. But Tim, first of all, I have learned so much already. This has been wonderful.